I'd like to call to order the meeting, District 115 High School public hearing on September 13th, 2011. May I have a roll call, please?
Here.
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 Here. Here.
Here. Thank you. We'll begin with the 2011-2012 budget hearing. Dr. Griffith?
Okay, Madam President, members of the board and audience, thank you for being here tonight. Alan Albus is here to present an overview of the budget for the 2011-12 school year. And Alan will both, as Deputy Superintendent for School Finance, will describe both the process that we used to put the budget together and then what the major components are for this school year. Alan, thank you.
Thank you. Tonight I'll give an overview of what the presentation will cover. It will include a review of the FY11 budget. Our meeting in July was shortly after the year ended, so we didn't have all the entries booked, and so we didn't really talk a lot about it in July. So we'll spend a little time tonight reviewing that. Talk about the legal requirements for budget adoption, decisions impacting the FY12 budget. I'll give you a summary or an overview by fund of the FY12 revenues and expenses, and then summarize the entire presentation. So starting with the FY11 budget, in general, we spend about 5 to 6 months developing the budget. It involves many individuals. It goes through many iterations before it's presented to the board for your consideration and approval. The reason it takes months to construct is we literally, year by year, tear it down and rebuild it line by line. So the overwhelming majority of the budget is zero-based. For example, most salary accounts are literally done on a zero-based process. Same with our health insurance, many of our capital projects, and it just takes time to go through that and put that all together. But that serves us well because the team that works on that really gets a handle as to what's in the budget. And as we go through periods of volatility like we're going through now on the economic front, it still gives us pretty good handles on what to expect on the revenue and expense side. So the next slide I'm going to put up is a summary of the FY11 budget, and I'd like to go through some of the lines there and talk about them. On the revenue side, you can see the first line, property taxes. We had a budget of $37.1 million. We took in 0.2% under budget. I attribute that to delinquent tax payments, and I think in future years we should collect those as those taxes are brought current. That's an easy line to do because we do the levy, the assessor or the county clerk gives us the extension amounts, and so that we budget off that. Some of the other lines, though, get a little tougher. The next line, the interest earnings line, you can see we were positive by $1,400. The only thing I'd point out with that revenue line is several years ago, that budget and the actual amounts were close to $1 million a year. In this year's budget,
Alan,
yes, sir.
That $1 million a year did not include the referendum funds, did it?
That did not include the referendum funds. That's correct. I didn't think it was possible, but the budget tonight has an even lower amount than last year's figure. Impact fees a couple of years ago were about $250,000. You can see where they've dropped to. Corporate personal property replacement tax is what CPPRT stands for. It's a very difficult item to budget because it's hard to get accurate figures on it. The Department of Revenue does put out projections, but I stopped using those many years ago, and I tend to do it off of historic amounts because I found that to be more accurate. State revenue, and that I want to focus on that for a little bit because you see that's a pretty significant variance there. Of that $1.2 million that was budgeted, about $350,000 of that is general state aid payments. Now the state made a concerted effort to get those payments out on time to school districts all across the state. But the balance of that money is what's called categorical payments, and that's for specific programs like driver's education or transportation reimbursement. Typically, the state allocates money and pays it out in 4 quarterly payments. Over the last couple of years, though, the state's fallen further and further behind to where we ended the year with the state owing us 3 payments. So in this year's budget, and the Finance Committee knows this because we talked this through as we were developing the FY11 budget, we anticipated 3 payments from the state for the year that had already ended that they owed us and had not paid, and only 1 payment for FY11. In the waning days of June, we received in some programs a 5th payment. So in some programs, the state is catching up a little bit. Now that's confusing because we were conservative on our budgeting at 1.2 million. We got 1.4, so we're 250,000 over. But we still ended the year with the state owing us about $500,000. Does that make sense? Okay.
If we were to go back a few years, what would the total revenue from the state be, ballpark?
I'd have to go back and look because the GSA would be a little higher.
What would it be, about $1.5 million?
Probably, yeah, 1.2 to 1.5
Okay.
in that area. Now that's a hard one. Again, though, as we went through the year, and even up until mid-June, we didn't know if we were going to receive those payments, and some of them came in June 29th and June 30th. But that was nice to see that come in. The federal money, we were slightly off on that. Fees and other revenues are the other area I want to focus in on. That $305,000 variance, and I apologize, I was playing with this earlier, and I got the arrow to work, and then it disappears on me. So the variance that I'm talking about right here of the $305,000 is really comprised in 2 areas. Our Little Scouts revenue for the year came in $150,000 over what we budgeted. And the balance of about another $130,000 came from a strategic decision we made during the year to pull some money out of our health insurance terminal reserve account. Now what that is an account that's set up, if we ever leave our co-op, we'll have a liability for what's called run-out claims, claims incurred but not yet paid. We made a decision to pull some of that money back to offset some of the other revenue losses. But that pot of money is not sitting out there that we can continually do that from. So that was a one-time decision. But so on the revenue side, when you add those really 3 things up, the extra state payments, the Little Scouts revenue, and pulling back some of the terminal reserve money, we're able to bring in revenue of $500,000 more than what was budgeted. Now, if we look at the expense side on salaries, came in $402,000 under budget, which is, I think, about a 1.8% variance. That's in discretionary salary accounts, and I'll dive into that for a second. In that $22 million salary line item, $14.3 million are teacher salaries, and our variance on that was $5,000. This variance is coming in with workshop expenses, supervision, event supervision expenses, teacher assistant expenses, and some clerical costs. And so that all gets attributed back to Jay Hoffman, Mike Cyrus, Tim Burkhalter, Carol White, as the year went on, either in hiring or in deploying people. They really, really tightened up on things, and that helped us. We also had a very good year on substitutes. Our sub-budget, Jennifer told me today, it was about the best it's been in 4 years. So we were under budget in subs by about $71,000. Benefits are pretty much right on. Purchase services, $100,000 of that $270 came in transportation, and I'll come back and talk about that in a minute. The other $150,000 or so is in O&M, and again, that goes to Carol White. She tightened up in O&M and in our capital projects, which impacts the capital outlay line. We went over on supplies. well under on capital outlay. And as you know, back in January, we gave you a projection that anticipated us spending $750,000 over budget on other and tuition. And a lot of that is attributable. That line accounts for children who come in and are outplaced for educational services. Some of those children are put in residential placements. Those costs can exceed $100,000 a year per child. So it only takes one or two children to have an impact. So in January, when we looked at the birds in hand and projected out the cost involved, we were looking at a $750,000 deficit. Between January and the end of the year, obviously there was some movement in there of kids either coming back and getting services within the district or moving out of the district. So that deficit didn't turn out to be as bad. But that really was kind of a catalyst. I mean, we've known economically and we've been very tight on what we've been trying to do, but we even ratcheted it up another degree when we looked at that projection in January. And we were able to offset that, as you can see. So on the expense side of the ledger, we actually came in $218,000 under budget. So now if you add all that together, if you look down at the bottom where the deficit line is, the adopted budget for last year was at $972,000 of deficit. We were reaching into our reserves by $972,000. But because of the revenue lines that I talked about and bringing expenses in under budget, it ended up being a $229,000 deficit. So all in all, I think it was a good year considering what we anticipated and what we experienced through the year. Before I move on to FY12, questions?
Given the variance on the salary line of $400,000 below budget, intuitively, wouldn't it seem that benefits would also run under budget?
Intuitively, I would agree. But again, a lot of that came from discretionary salaries. And what I mean by that, again, extra duty, event supervision, workshops, teacher assistants, student services, clerical. So your benefit line is really your health insurance. It's not that we had a lot fewer people, but some of the hourly costs that we incur on salaries, we reduced. Substitute costs were down. A little bit would hit the TRS line, but very little. But I get what you're saying, but again, it was more discretionary salary type accounts than...
But it's salary paid to people where we're not providing benefits?
Right, or it's extra duty things. So if somebody works a football game, they're getting extra hours. It's not really impacting their benefits. Okay, so for the whole board, this is really the first update we've had since January or February in going through this, and this is better than what we were looking at. And again, and I'll summarize it at the end, 3 revenue lines, the state payments, Little Scouts, pulling back terminal reserve. Then on the expense side, really again, Jay Hoffman, Tim Burkhalter, Carol White, Mike Cyrus on the salaries. Carol White on purchase services and the capital outlay. It's literally in January when we updated that, we went to Carol and said, unless it's a life safety issue and we can delay the project, delay it. So I will acknowledge some of this is kicking the can down the road a little bit on some projects. But it's trying to find that balance between eating up reserves and addressing our needs.
Alan, you said that you were going to explain that the purchase services, the $272,000 expense reduction was largely related to transportation. You were going to explain it further.
Oh, I'm sorry. The tuition line came in under budget because some kids either came back and got services here or moved out of the district. Well, there's a correlation there because that means we're not providing transportation services to kids too. So there was a reduction in the number of students receiving transportation services. There are kids who take cabs to area schools, and it can cost us $50, $60 a day for those students. So again, a decrease, can start to add up. Now, we're also vulnerable to 3 or 4 kids moving in any given year as well. But this time it fell in our
And
favor.
again, these are students with special needs.
Primarily NSSED, or, yeah, that's right.
Yes. Yes, sir.
Alan, could you maybe spend a little bit of time for the benefit of the audience in describing 2 lines up there under revenues, fees, and other, because it's a little bit over 10% of the total, and under expenditures, other/tuition, because it's about 20% of the total. And so I think when people see the word other in such large numbers, it raises some questions. And then one thing I would like to point
for a wide spectrum of things that come in. The other tuition, a couple of years ago, the state changed the accounting structure that we have to follow, and they combined other and tuition payments, which I wish they had not done, because what's captured down there right now is our debt payments. So for the bonds for the referendum, the interest, the principal, as well as special ed tuition. And those 3 things make up the bulk of the items down there. Legal requirements for adopting a budget. A budget must be adopted by the end of the first quarter of your fiscal year. Our fiscal year starts July 1st, so September 30th is the end of our first quarter. Prior to adoption, a school board must place the budget on public display for at least 30 days. We did that with the meeting starting in July, and the budget has been on display for over 30 days. We also have to schedule a date and time for a public hearing on the budget, and that's why we're here tonight, because we had set this date back in July. And when we realized there was a conflict with the high school open house, we moved the board meeting to last night, but we didn't have another 30-day window to re-advertise for the public hearing. So our option was to either go ahead with the meeting tonight or schedule a meeting further in September and try and capture that 30-day window. We opted to leave it as had been advertised. Publish in a newspaper of general circulation a notice of the public hearing, and that's all been done as well. Things that went into building, as we sat down to look at the FY12 budget, we start with our 5-year projection, and that's been reliable over the years, and we look at that and kind of extrapolate from there. But based on what we are looking at there, what we're hearing from the state and seeing economically, we implemented a support staff early retirement program. That's one that we constructed last spring. We brought it to the board approved it. We had one provision in that. It had to save dollars from year 1 going forward. The way it was constructed, and when all the smoke cleared and everybody signed up for it, we had 10 people elect to participate in it, and we're saving about $250,000 in year 1 through that program. Some of that savings comes because of some of the people who retired left. We chose not to fill the positions at all. We've had administrative staff reductions. The two highest profile ones would be Mike Cyrus leaving to accept a job with an international school, and Dr. Mary Quinn leaving to accept an assistant principalship. Neither position has been filled, and the duties have been dispersed among other people. We've had instructional staff reductions as well. The majority of them have come from a slight decline in enrollment and a tightening up on the scheduling process that's utilized. And I don't know if Harry wants to expand on that at all, or if there's any questions on that. We have the last several years ridden the wave of the referendum. We made significant improvements in both campuses, and as the economy went south, one of the true discretionary things that you have are your capital improvement projects, and we've been deferring some of those, and we acknowledge that. We're doing that somewhat in the FY12 budget, but we can't keep doing that forever, because as I said earlier, it's a little bit like kicking the can down the road, and you get to a point where those projects start stacking up and they don't go away. So we've been able to do that for a few years, but we're going to have to start coming out of that, and that's one of the things I think the Operations Committee spent a lot of time on this fall, is developing a very comprehensive facility plan. We've also renegotiated or rebid some significant vendor contracts. Our custodial cleaning service, GCA, we went to them and said we needed to cut $100,000. And we went in with a concept of doing that, and they came back with a different concept to achieve the same thing. And they were a great partner in working with this. So we're going to see a $100,000 expense reduction in our custodial cleaning service line this year. We also rebid our transportation service. We stayed with the same provider, but we're estimating the cost savings from that to be about $40,000. And the reason I say estimating is because in this contract we've gone to paying for the fuel. So we have to make estimates about what we think the price of fuel will be and then extrapolate that out. When we put all those things together and what we know about the revenues, so the top three obviously impact on our staffing, and this next slide you've seen before, except now we've added 11-12 to it. It shows what's happened in administration, support staff, and teaching positions over the last several years within the district. Overall, we're down 37 positions. Now, again, some of that is due to enrollment. A lot of that, though, is due simply to the economics that we're dealing with and making reductions. I think the difference from 2010-11 to 11-12 was 14.87 positions.
Alan, I'd just like to highlight that last column there, the percent reductions in the various areas, because I think those numbers accurately reflect what we as a board and you all as an administration have determined to be our priorities, and we have struggled to protect our instructional programs. We have worked hard to protect the things that impact our students directly as we've gone through this difficult economic time. And, I think those numbers reflect that. And you can see administrative reductions of 26% versus teacher reductions of only 8%. So, and support staff there in the middle. So I just wanted to take the opportunity to point that out.
So taking all those components, putting them together with what we know on the revenue side, the budget that's been on display has total revenues of $42.8 million and total expenses of $42.4 million. Again, the process we use, our track record in building that, we're very confident with these numbers, and we think this is a good budget. So we're in the black. This doesn't restore our fund balances, but it's a start to rebuilding them over the next several years. It took several years to reduce them. It's going to take several years to build them back up.
Alan, could you indicate where the fund balance is going to be and what our target is for that?
Yeah, I have that on my desk. Should take us up, I'm going to say about 3 million, so it's going to be less than our 10%. Our 10% target would be 10% of our expenses, so we should be at about 4.2 million. So we still have a little ways to go. So we'd be at about roughly 7%, I think. That doesn't sound right. At the end of this year?
I think we're at about 2 million based on,
I'll clarify it as soon as we're done, because I have it, it's sitting on my desk.
and I would point out that our policy is to maintain a minimum of 10%. And you use the word target, and I'm not trying to correct you so much, it's just set the tone. That's our minimum as opposed to our target value, and we've very knowingly been below our minimum here as we've gone through this difficult economic time, and through the Path to Black and other initiatives that resulted in the kinds of reductions in expenses that you've been talking about, we can see our way back to achieving that minimum and beyond over a number of years, as you point out.
Well, and I'd like to elaborate on what you said about the Path to Black, because we started talking about that in July of '09, and we said there were 3 components to that, or 3 legs to that stool. One was staff reductions, one was the TIF coming online, and for those who are not familiar with that term, Lake Forest has what's called a tax increment financing district, and the tax revenues generated from that are not coming to the school district nor to the city. They're going into a TIF fund to pay off the infrastructure improvements of that area. That is set to expire. So when that expires, we anticipate a revenue increase of $500,000 to $600,000 per year. That's the second leg of the stool. Third one was a contract with the LFEA that's more reflective of the current economy. The contract that just expired was signed in 2006, and the world was a very different place at the time. So to date, we've done the staff reductions that we talked about. The TIF will come online, and we're currently negotiating a successor contract to the 2006 one. So we really have not wavered a lot since 2009. We identified what we needed. We've stayed the course. We've tried to have sort of a soft landing, as Dick, as you pointed out. We didn't gouge the instructional programs, and tried to find that balance between utilizing reserves and maintaining continuity in program, and then dig our way out of this. So I think we're on course to do that.
Could you explain the logic behind the 10% minimum target and why there's a need for a reserve? I'm sure that would be some interest to the audience.
I wasn't here when the policy was adopted, but personally I like it. I like the 10% because it moves as the budgets move. And I think the last 3 years are the perfect example of why we want to maintain a reserve and utilize a reserve. We're low compared to many of our surrounding districts, but we have sufficient cash flow at that level, and we meet our needs. If we were a district in Cook County, we'd be talking about a much higher fund balance because of delays in property tax payments and things like that.
Maybe the best way to address that, if I can be so bold, is to think in terms of what would have happened had we had our current fund balance when we entered the downturn in '08, given the teacher's contract that we had, the other commitments and fixed costs that we had going forward. We would not have had the $4 or $5 million that we drew down from our reserve fund available to us. We'd have had to either seek that money somewhere else, or we'd have had to make cuts of that magnitude, into our program. So.
Right. Any other questions? Okay, to summarize, so if you walk away, there are really 2 main points I'd like you to walk away with tonight. For FY11, the deficit is not as large as originally budgeted, and that's due to unanticipated revenue from the state, the Little Scouts revenue, the terminal reserve reduction, and salaries coming in under budget. The salaries coming in under budget went a long way to mitigating the overage on the special ed tuition, and that helped tremendously. On the expense, or for the FY12 budget, it's balanced by $400,000 through a combination of staff reductions, project deferrals, and vendor contract revisions. Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you, Alan. Board members, at this time, do you have any other questions or things you'd like to say about this? Then I would like to open up to the audience. If you have any questions or comments that you'd like to ask of us or of Alan, please feel free.
We didn't pay the ComEd bill either.
You didn't pay the ComEd bill? That's, yeah. All right.
Perhaps your conservation's gotten out of hand.
Well, let me just add that, Alan, I think we are going to post this on our website, so this can be viewed, the slides also. And I don't know if you'd like a copy of it, but we could also make copies available to those who would like to see that.
You know, Alan, maybe you did cover this, but I think it's helpful to just remind ourselves that when we were starting the last fiscal year, we had the bulk of our revenues tied to the consumer price index increase, which was 0.1%. And as Dick mentioned, we had contractually obligated ourselves to a number of expenses, including the contract with the LFEA, which on average was 6% plus. So, you know, we were starting the year obviously with some real challenges, and I think as you described, the work that you went through got that deficit down to where it was, but that was a tough hand we were dealt starting the year.
In last year's presentation, if you recall, there were a couple of slides that showed over about a 3-year period in our operating funds, Ed, O&M, Trans, Illinois Municipal Retirement. Our expenses have been pretty flat. I think they went up less than 0.5% in each year, while at the same time the contract, you're right, was calling for increases of 5, 6 or greater percent, health insurance increases, and increases in the IMR rate. So to offset those, we made a lot of reductions in a lot of other areas. But unfortunately, in the last couple of years, the revenue declines. When you lose a revenue source of $1 million in interest a year, it's hard to recoup from that. Then the state gets behind 3/4 of a year in payments. And you're right, the 0.1% of 1% in the history of the tax cap, that's the lowest amount that's ever been incurred. And because we were locked in, we knew FY11 we would not be able to balance. We knew that in 2009, but that's when we started the path to black and planned for it. So this has been a multi-year process. But again, I don't think we've wavered a lot from it. I mean, we've set out what we need to do, and the things that we can do to this point in time, we've done. And we're currently negotiating, as I said earlier, the successor contract, and then we'll have the TIF come online.
We have a question, yes. Do you mind going to the? That's fine. Just state your name and address and feel free to ask your question.
Gary Pete, 515 Valley Road here in Lake Forest. My understanding is the teachers are currently working without a contract. What, if any, assumptions have been made in terms of increases in teacher salaries for this budget year? Or in the alternative, what have the teachers asked for?
I think I'll turn that over to Dr. Griffith.
Right. Yeah, presently, the Board of Education is negotiating with the teachers over their contract. And because the negotiations themselves are right in the middle of negotiations, the board's not able to comment on the content of the negotiations.
So the teachers have not, I apologize for interrupting, but the teachers have not made public their demands.
That's correct.
Go ahead.
Excuse me, although at the very least the assumption must have been made that salaries are going to remain the same because you reached some figure here.
We've made assumptions based on what we see in the marketplace and the current economy, and we built those in. Now, budgets can be amended, and if at the conclusion of negotiations, those assumptions are no longer true, then we may have to amend the budget. But we made what we think are reasonable assumptions in building the budget.
Very good. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments? Either side of the table? All right, seeing none, may I have a motion, please?
Move that the Board of Education adopt the 2011-2012 budget as presented.
Second.
Okay, board members, just a clarification. The hearing actually has to be a separate event from the actual vote of the budget itself, so the board would need to come out of the session for the hearing, it's just a technicality, and then vote to go into a special session to take action on the budget itself.
Then I will need a motion to adjourn
So
budget
moved.
hearing, please.
Second.
Second. All in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right. Then I would now like to call to order the meeting of the Lake Forest Community High School District 115 Board of Education special meeting. May I have a roll call, please?
Here. Mr. Edson?
Here.
Mr. Block?
Here.
Mr. Scribner?
Here.
Mr. Bergner?
Here.
Mr. Carey?
Here.
Mrs. Gold?
Here. Thank you. Dr. Griffith, the recommendation?
Yes, board members, you have in some greater detail before you the budget. It has been discussed by the Board Finance Committee also over a 5-month period that this has been constructed. You've seen the overall summary, and so I would recommend that the board adopt the 2011-12 budget as presented.
Comments or questions? All right. Jim, would you like to repeat what you said earlier? All over
I
again.
move that the Board of Education adopt the 2011-2012 budget as presented.
Second.
All right. May I have a roll call vote, please?
Mrs. Block?
Aye.
Mrs. Snowden? Aye. Mr. Edson?
Aye.
Mr. Carey?
Aye.
Mr. Bergner?
Aye.
Mr. Scribner?
Aye.
Mrs. Gold?
Aye. Motion carries. Is there any other business at this time the board wants to bring forth? All right, seeing and hearing none, I would like to thank you, Alan, for that presentation and for all the work that you've put into this budget, you and your team. I know you've got to be creative in these days, and you have to be patient, and we appreciate the hard work you do. Okay, given that, is there a motion to adjourn?
So moved.
Second.
All in favor?
Aye.
Meeting is adjourned. Thank you.